Then we are live. Good day, comrade. I don't know if comrade is acceptable in your profession, but comrade Ziyaad Patel, welcome to our webinar series. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Ali, and also a very good afternoon to your viewers. And I want to thank you and the Africa for Palestine movement for inviting me on this webinar. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Those who are not familiar with us, Africa for Palestine is a solidarity organization, human rights organization based in South Africa, doing work in the African continent. Part of the work that we do is to push out Israeli influence in the continent, and we work with many other organizations that identify with our cause, religious movement, your church movements, Christian, Muslim, across all religions, political parties, trade union movements, the broader civil society organization spectrum. And we are also reaching out for any other organization that identify with the cause to work with us in that regard. We have started a webinar series on our Facebook page, and if you can check in our video tab, there are many other videos of webinars we've had in the past. This webinar series seeks to invite people from different walks of life that do work on the Palestinian question and other social justice issues. And today, in this episode, we have Attorney Ziyaad Patel, who is well known in South Africa, in the African continent, and in the Middle East for the work he does in the law fraternity. Before I misrepresent Attorney Ziyaad, I'll let him tell us about yourself and the work that you do.
Yes, Ali, I run a commercial law firm, in fact, in Johannesburg, and have been an attorney for almost 15 years and more. But I got involved with the Palestinian struggle and the liberation of Palestine in 2008, 2009, during Operation Castlet. I think your viewers are well familiar with, that war that was led by the IDF against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. I was appalled by what had happened, what was going on, the news reports, the images that were emanating from Al Jazeera network. For the first time, I knew about the occupation and the aspirations of Palestinian people, but particularly that war in the Gaza Strip touched my moral conscience, and I thought that I needed to utilize my skills as an attorney and as in the field of constitutional law and human rights to be able to champion the Palestinian cause. So yeah, that's where it started for me in terms of the Palestinian cause. And through the years, I've managed to work with various different organizations, both in South Africa and abroad and in the Middle East, in championing the Palestinian cause, and also other causes around the world. I assisted organizations in South Africa, the Muslim Lawyers Association, on the Ogaden people and the plight of the Ogaden people, putting together a docket before the South African police authorities and the national prosecuting authorities. Also assisted with the Rohingya, what was going on in Rohingya recently, Myanmar. That was also a very, appalling situation. Assisted the Kashmiri Action Campaign. So there's been various organizations that I've worked with. In the field of Palestine, I'm involved in Lawfare. Lawfare is the utilization of legal mechanisms in holding war criminals accountable for crimes perpetrated with impunity. And that seems to be the environment within which Israel operates. That operation by Israel is causing egregious crimes against Palestinians, And I don't think anybody in the region is able to move forward because of the, the unhealthy situation that prevails in that environment. The occupation continues to be belligerent. So Ali, also with Palestine, I've worked with Palestinian groups involved with, the prisoners campaign. I've managed to speak on behalf of international organizations in Geneva in 2016 on Palestinian prisoners' rights and the situation of Palestinian prisoners, both in the occupied Palestinian territories, as well as the international laws that are breached by Israel and including the Palestinian Authority. So that submission is is on my website, and it is also easily accessible, where I addressed the South African Human Rights, the United Nations Human Rights Council. In South Africa, I've worked with the BDS coalition. I've worked with your organization, and also I want to acknowledge the Palestinian Solidarity Committee in Cape Town that has assisted in what I've done is preparation of a draft IPSRA bill, which we'll probably get to speak about a little later.
That's a lot, Ziyaad. That's a lot. Those who are not aware, Comrade Ziyaad is part of the legal minds in South Africa that are very active in the Palestinian movement. So when we go to protest, and when we sense that the time Comrade Ziyaad, the MSC, and the Law Resource Center on speed dial, say, hey, police are here, they want to arrest us. And we appreciate the work that you do. I'm getting into Comrade Ziyaad. Many people, including ourselves, speak about the Israeli illegal occupation and how criminal Israel is in oppression of Palestine. So many people hear that and others don't understand that. So in layman terms, can you explain to us the illegality of the occupation, the illegality of Israel as an occupying state, as a human rights abuser, in layman terms?
Sure, Ali. The question of Palestine is a complicated question. I think there's a wrong and a right, and the clear answer to that is that the Palestinians are in the right, and the manner in which Israelis treat Palestinians are in the wrong. We've got to understand the geopolitical context within which this conflict has been carrying on for now almost 72 years, if we call it from the time of the Nakba in 1948, and then in 1949 was the first Arab War, where Palestinians were then, there was the mass exodus of Palestinians from their homeland and relocated in the diaspora. But even if we go earlier than 1948, 1949, if we look at, I think, 1917, there was the Balfour Declaration. And under that situation, during World War I, Palestine was still controlled by the Ottoman Empire, but there was already an agreement. And we're seeing history play out itself again with the US President Trump. But that time in 1917, there was already a silent agreement between Lord Balfour or the Foreign Secretary of the British government, Balfour, and Lord Rothschild, representing the Zionist Association of Ireland and the United Kingdom. And in that declaration, there was the gifting of Palestinian land in order for the Jewish people to make a homeland. So that was already contrived already in 1917. And of course, what had happened is as Jewish people and as people immigrated to the land of Palestine, eventually the situation got to a point where Palestinians were then driven out of their homes and that's where we're looking at the 1948-1949 Nakba. Then there's been a the relationship was quite, there was a great deal of animosity between the Arab states at a particular time, standing with the Arab and the Palestinian people. But we saw how that got watered down throughout the years in what had happened in subsequent wars between Israel and its surrounding Arab neighbors. I think in particular, one should remember that we always talk about the 1967 borders. And that's important because that's where the question of occupation comes in. What had previously happened was Egypt had control over the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank was annexed by Jordan. So Jordan had control over the West Bank. But after the 1967 war, what occurred was that Israel had occupied the West Bank and Israel had occupied the Gaza Strip. And that was considered under international law as the occupied territories, whereby the people living in those occupied Palestinian territories should be protected under international law and the Geneva Conventions. So the Geneva Convention speaks to humanitarian law and what becomes the rights and responsibility of the occupier over the occupied. And that's where our issue is with the state of Israel, is that it continues to contravene and violate international law, international humanitarian law, as it does not consider or it does not take into account its international obligations in taking care of the occupied Palestinian people. Just going further, more recent into history, after the 67 war, there was a subsequent war in 73, and there was the Yom Kippur War, and after that there was also this relationship between Egypt and Israel warming down. There was the Camp David Accord. That Camp David Accord technically brought all hostilities to an end between Egypt and Israel, and unfortunately the Palestinian people lost its ally, Egypt, in that circumstance. Very close to that period was also Jordan, who signed an agreement with Israel with the warming of relationships. So we've seen, from 1917, Palestinian land being gifted without Palestinian people's knowledge and consent and participation in any of this process. And again, as we go through history, we've had, different accords. We've had the Oslo Accords in the 1990s that dissipated a lot of Palestinian rights on the premise that a Palestinian Authority will be a temporary authority towards working towards a lasting peace of a two-state solution. But Palestinian rights just continue to be watered down. And after, subsequent to that, we know that we've had 2008, 2009 Gaza war. We've had the Pillar of Defense war in 2012. And then, the most recent war in Gaza in 2014 under Protective Edge, where thousands of Palestinian people have lost their lives. The statistics are horrific, Ali, absolutely horrific. But coming back to your question as to, why do we need to support the Palestinian cause and why it's important for your viewers to do so? It's simple, because international law says so. And international law has put a particular premise on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It speaks about the protection of Palestinian rights. It talks about, the non-alteration status of Jerusalem. We know that 1st of July, there was a lot of discussion and a lot of talk about Netanyahu and the Israeli government wanting to annex at least 30% of the West Bank territory. That was preceded by the US President Trump in 2018 or 2017 December, and then carrying out in 2018 by May, I think, of moving the United States Embassy from Tel Aviv to the West Jerusalem. and that was a violation, a very, very clear violation of international law, because we also have this alteration status that we've got to, keep in mind that Jerusalem is protected under international law pending a resolution to the conflict between the parties. So neither the United States or any other government is in a position to, gift Jerusalem. I just want to, speak a little bit about Jerusalem. Ali, the UN General Assembly resolution, and this is on the status of Jerusalem. It's a General Assembly resolution 1019, speaks to this effect. Just hold on for me. I'm just
no problem,
sorry.
no problem at all.
So the UN General Assembly resolution regarding the status of Jerusalem states that, stressing that Jerusalem is a final status issue to be resolved through the negotiations in line with relevant United Nations resolutions, expressing in this regard its deep regret at recent decisions concerning the status of Jerusalem. And then again, the resolution states, affirms that any decision and actions which purport to have altered the character, status, or demographic composition of the holy city of Jerusalem have no legal effect, are null and void, and must be rescinded in compliance with relevant resolutions of the Security Council. And in this regard, calls upon all states to refrain from the establishment of diplomatic missions in the holy city of Jerusalem pursuant to Council Resolution 478 of 1980. And it says that it demands all states comply with the Security Council resolution regarding the holy city of Jerusalem and not recognize any actions or measures contrary to those resolutions. I also just want to read this last part. It reiterates its call for the reversal of negative trends on the ground that are imperiling the two-state solution and for the intensification and acceleration of international and regional efforts and support aimed at achieving without delay a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in the Middle East on the basis of the relevant United Nations resolutions, the Madrid terms of reference, including the principle of land for peace, the Arab Peace Initiative and the Quartet Roadmap, an end to Israeli occupation that began in 1967. So Ali, this is very clear that this resolution that I am just speaking to you about is informing your viewers that if we deal with the question of annexation, we don't even need to go to that point of saying whether the annexation is lawful or not. And we need to understand that Israel, in terms of its internal laws, would want to annex 30% of the West Bank territory. But we know that the West Bank under international law is protected territory, and that Israel has obligations under the Geneva Conventions to ensure the well-being, safety, and well-being, safety of the occupied people, which are the Palestinians in this instance. So we have international law stating that you can't alter the status of Jerusalem without a lasting peace or a negotiation between both parties. And Palestinians are certainly not in this negotiation. So what we have here is we have the President of the United States unilaterally and arbitrarily deciding to move its mission or embassy office to West Jerusalem. And this is in violation of international law. And obviously we know that the Zionist regime wants to do everything in its power to annex and take more territory, and would have obviously welcomed the US's decision of moving its embassy. But there was a greater vision to this on their side, which was to look at this whole question of wanting to formally annex West Bank territory. And this is not permissible under international law. So that I wanted to make reference. Also, we had this very bullish mentality by the United States, especially at that time by the Ambassador Nikki Haley, who made all sorts of provocative threats to the United Nations and to world leaders whose countries have voted against the United States, rightfully negating to altering the status of Jerusalem. So the US also utilized a lot of bullying tactics at the UN against those states and member states that voted in favor of the resolution and not against the resolution. If I may carry on, Ali, is that fine?
Yes, yes. You've touched on international law, and for our viewers and audience, we'll try to make it as layman and as simple as possible to digest. We know that Israel qualifies as a serial international abuser and a serial human rights abuser as it relates to the Geneva Conventions. And you did explain what are they on the Human Rights Geneva Conventions. The apartheid wall, what is called as an apartheid wall, a wall that is being built, it continuously getting built in Palestine to cut through villages, cut through farms, cut through Palestinian lands, is one of the examples of the violation of international law as per the International Court of Justice. Those some of the trends, some of the things that in the legal fraternity justify Israel as a serial international law violator?
Absolutely. The ICJ judgment, the International Court of Justice judgment was an advisory, it has an advisory opinion. It was called to determine the lawfulness of what we call the Iron Wall that traversed through Palestinian territories. And we talk about the cantonization of Palestinian towns and neighborhoods where this wall actually traverses through. So imagine what it's doing. I mean, we had a situation, with the Berlin Wall, for instance. You had East Germany and West Germany. You had one German people that was separated by an iron wall, and obviously there were restrictions imposed. And I mean, that kind of situation in history is replaying itself here, where you've got this wall traversing through Palestinian neighborhoods. You've got checkpoints at any given street or end of a neighborhood. So you're making life very difficult for Palestinians. So there's constitutional rights. I mean, not only constitutional rights if we consider it within the South African context, but universal human rights. The rights to freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom to trade, the right to dignity, the right to life, the right to equality. These are universal norms that we as a country know what it was and what it meant to live during the times of apartheid and colonialism, and pushing those shackles of colonialism aside and being able to have political emancipation from the crime of apartheid. Apartheid is a crime against humanity. So this wall that Israel has built is nothing less than separating Palestinian neighborhoods, taking control over Palestinian land, imposing colonized principles, and more importantly, imposing institutionalized apartheid. So, you don't have just the segregation physically, but you've also got this political and legal segregation between Palestinians and Israelis. For instance, even this talk about 30% annexation in the West Bank, the Israel is speaking about imposing or administering Israeli law and sovereignty over 30% of the West Bank territory, which technically means that you're going to have Israeli law applied to a particular area within the territory, and then you've got military and administrative law in the other instance. So there isn't this uniformity of law. And that's why we always speak about Israel being an apartheid state. There was a study done in 2008, 2009. At that time, if I can recall, it was Virginia Telly who, and amongst them there were, I think it was Richard Falk, if I may be mistaken, stand to be corrected. But I know Virginia Telly was one of the academics that wrote, and one of the findings of that report, it was done at the behest of the South African government at the time, in the determination of its relationship with apartheid Israel. And findings were clear that, the findings included that there were practices of apartheid, colonialism, and belligerent occupation. So there's huge there's a wide and huge body of law and academic writings and fact-finding mission reports. One must also make reference to the UN ESQA report, which was the Economic Commission of Western Asian States. And in that finding, it was clear that Israel is an apartheid state, and that one of the recommendations in bringing Israel to account was to implement the boycotts, divestments, and sanctions campaign against Israel. And more particularly, we know that even the United Nations Human Rights Council, at the behest of its members, requested that a list or register be provided of all companies that are operating within the occupied Palestinian territories, that these companies be listed so that countries and economies around the world know that these countries are operating within the OPTs, and there should be boycotts, divestment, and sanctions imposed as a rehabilitative measure. So yes, the apartheid wall is one of the it is symptomatic of the situation that is prevailing in Palestine, and therefore we say that that situation has to be rectified, because it basically restricts Palestinians' human rights.
And interesting that you speak about fact-finding mission that will they do stand in international law. One of the icons of international law, Justice Goldstone, also made a report on Israeli war crimes in Gaza. Interesting enough. There's recently, and we've seen in the media reports in international media as well, that the Palestinians have successfully, after many attempts, presented their case at the International Criminal Court. And the leading prosecutor is looking into the case. Tell us from a legal perspective, how far do you see that going?
Yes, so that is a case, there's a few cases, that we could look at and where it is. In my involvement in lawfare and holding war criminals accountable for crimes perpetrated with impunity, we've had South African cases. I think viewers may be well aware of the Khadija Davids complaint that we had lodged in 2012 or 2011, and the decisions that had emanated out of the South African Police Services and the National Directorate of Priority, the NPA, or the National Prosecuting Authority, more importantly from the South African Police Services, that they would investigate any of those war commanders if they had to come to South Africa. This, Ali, I'm speaking in connection with the flotilla raid attack, where I had represented the journalist Khadija from Cape Town. So, we've had that case. We've had the Gaza docket that was one of the criminal complaints that was lodged after Operation Cast Lead. That was considered at the investigative agencies. That would be what I've mentioned earlier. And then, there's, lawfare can entail many different kinds of adjudication. It can be submissions to the United Nations Human Rights Council. It can be in domestic jurisdictions, like, for instance, in the flotilla raid attack, victims from different countries. There was Furkan Dohan, who was the youngest person to have been murdered on the flotilla raid attack. His family took a case to the United States, to the courts there, and holding Ehud Barak and them accountable. There's been the Spanish complaint. There's been a complaint in the United Kingdom. So what we've got to understand is that in this international forum of international criminal law and the exercise of universal jurisdiction, before answering your question, because we need to understand what universal jurisdiction is. It means that, because it's a crime against humanity, or that it's the most abominable crimes against mankind, hostis humanus generis, that it is a peremptory norm, a jus cogens norm or law, that any country is able to sit and exercise jurisdiction against those perpetrators. because that is constituting universal violation of human rights. These are violation of human rights to the extent of, we speak of genocide or crimes against humanity, like the crime of apartheid or torture, or war crimes, or even the crime of aggression, or pirating in the high seas, for instance. So these are crimes where the gravity of the crime is substantial. And this is where the Palestinian case, has been brought to the International Criminal Court. Now it's being challenged, Ali. It's been challenged by countries like the United States, Australia, Canada, and quite interestingly, even in Africa, a country like Uganda has actually supported the US, Australia, and Israel in making sure that the Palestine case is not heard at the ICC. So to give some context to the situation, what transpired was that Palestine was given observer status at the United Nations, and because of its non-party observer status at the United Nations, it then applied to the International Criminal Court to be recognized as a party or a state party. And in that happening, what would occur is that it would request that the International Criminal Court complement jurisdiction, or the International Criminal Court prosecutor complement jurisdiction in the occupied Palestinian territories, where war crimes and the most abominable crimes have been perpetrated against Palestinians. So, the nature of crimes that I've just outlined earlier. And that's where the issue lies, is that the ICC prosecutor has found jurisdiction and saying that it will want to investigate. However, it is seeking an advisory opinion or a ruling from the pretrial chamber because of the contestation. And I think that period has been extended. So there's been submissions by these countries that have continuously not wanted Palestine to be recognized as a state party, and not wanting the ICC to investigate, or the ICC prosecutor to investigate Israel's war crimes, and not wanting jurisdiction, of course. So they are now opposing it at the ICC and have made submissions to the ICC pretrial chamber.
We've mentioned Ziyaad a number of institutions, international institutions, the ICJ, the ICC, the United Nations Human Rights Council. Are these institutions legally, through lawfare, of course, able to hold Israel accountable for its crime against Palestinians?
I believe that if parties and state parties had to act bona fide, if they had to act in good faith and act within the reason of why these institutions were created in the first place, and not allowing certain countries, to bully other countries. And that's unfortunately the reality of the world, is that economics and political influences play a huge role. So one of the main contentions against the ICC is that why do we only see, for instance, African leaders being taken to the ICC, but where are other leaders and where are other state parties being held accountable for the most egregious crimes? My argument to that is that as an international human rights lawyer, as an international human rights defender, we need to work within certain forums. And if there's forums that have been created that can provide some justice to victims, then we need to be able to use those forums. And we need to advocate for justice against perpetrators of injustice and oppression. So, the interesting part is that in the case of South Africa, we've implemented their own statute. We've got the implementation of the International Criminal Court Act. Over and above that, we've got other legislation like the Foreign Military Assistance Act, which speaks about not permitting any South African citizens to serve in any foreign armies, or serve in armies where there may be conflict without getting the necessary permissions and so forth. There's an act that speaks about the prohibition of mercenary activities, which is even more detailed than the Foreign Military Assistance Act. However, regulations still need to be passed there. I'm saying that, within this domain of international criminal law and exercising universal jurisdiction, there has to be forums where perpetrators of injustice can be held accountable. So in that instance, we've got the International Criminal Court Act and the International Criminal Court by and large, and it must be utilized as a legal mechanism. There's nothing wrong with not utilizing it. The mechanisms are there and available for Palestinians. In this instance, if the court is able to confirm the jurisdiction and hold war criminals accountable, basically what happens is we're trying to, create a better world, Ali. That's what it's all about. It's about saying that we're living now in the 21st century. There's so much of militarism, arms and ammunition trade. I just want to speak a little bit about that as well. And innocent civilians are caught up in these conflicts, and we find women, children, becoming the victims. Just making reference to something. Magdalena Mughrabi, Deputy General Director of Amnesty International, she says the following, if I may go on. For 4 weeks, this was in connection with the time when Palestinians were, advocating for their right of return and the right of return march that was going on, and we knew about Israeli snipers on the Gaza borders that were Palestinians. I mean, so many Palestinians, and also, medical personnel, people from media were shot and killed. And this is what she says. She was the Deputy Regional Director of Amnesty International. She said, for 4 weeks, the world has watched in horror as Israeli snipers and other soldiers in full protective gear and behind the fence have attacked Palestinian protesters with live ammunition and tear gas. Despite wide international condemnation, the Israeli army has not reversed its illegal orders to shoot unarmed protesters. This is what is coming out of Amnesty International. She goes on to say, furthermore, she added, the international community must act concretely and stop the delivery of arms and military equipment to Israel, and that inaction would continue to fuel serious human rights abuses against thousands of men, women and children suffering the consequences of life under Israel's cruel blockade of Gaza. Listen to this, Ali. Israel is one of Washington's closest allies and a major buyer of US-made military equipment, but European Union nations, including France, Germany, the UK, and Italy, have licensed large volumes of military equipment for Israel. So this is coming from Amnesty International. And just to add to this, recently I heard a report on BBC where a British parliamentarian justified the selling of arms to Saudi Arabia. We know that there's an ongoing conflict in Yemen, and huge numbers of Yemenis people, civilians, are being killed in indiscriminate bombing. The UK politician, justifies the sale of British arms to Saudi Arabia on the basis that, if we don't sell those arms to them, they will get those arms from somewhere else. But all of this in the protection of British jobs. Now, my argument is, why do we need to protect British jobs or American jobs or any jobs whatsoever that's involved in this environment of militarism? And this militarism is what is causing so much of cruelty and inhumaneness in the world, and this bullying of powerful nations over weaker nations. And this is where we're having this continued gross violations of human rights. So we have all these countries that I've just mentioned in the European Union, France, Germany, UK, Italy. Most of these countries are parties to the Rome Statute. Now, we know that modern warfare can be absolutely lethal. We're still investigating what had happened in Lebanon, Beirut recently in that explosion. But we can see what that kind of munitions can do and what kind of destruction it can cause to buildings and its surrounding environment. We've seen neighborhoods in Gaza flattened during cast lead and during protective edge. Children have lost limbs. Water installations have been damaged. Schools, schools protected under Geneva Conventions have been damaged by Israel for indiscriminate bombing. So what we've got to understand here is, when we talk about warfare, there must be this there must be this discerning of distinction and proportionality. So one has to be able to distinguish between army combatants and civilians, and also indiscriminate bombing would mean that also proportionality, that if there's a response to an armed attack, there must be a proportional response. Now, what has come out of fact-finding missions when Israel has been the perpetrator of injustice is that there's been this wanton destruction of property and making the most impact in warfare where civilians have been the target. Ali, I want to also make reference to something that's very important. This emanated from the Operation Cast Lead in 2008, 2009. I'm just going to find, the name of that finding mission by the United Nations Finding Mission Report. So yeah, I'm just going to, get that in a short while.
Yeah. You've touched a lot on the IEC and other avenues. We know that you're involved in local in South Africa through courts and Lawfare to hold those who participated in the Israeli army. For audience who don't know, we have South Africa does allow double citizenship, so you can be a citizen of South Africa and a citizen of another country. And in the recent past, we've had South Africans who went to participate in the Israeli Defense Force, and you've been working on something like that. And it's interesting enough that besides these international avenues, there are other avenues in law that can be exploited to hold Israel accountable. And we know that you're also dealing with IPPSRA. So just tell us about that, the work that you're doing to try and pursue those who were actively participating in the IDF during these war crimes, and the other avenues we can use through Lawfare outside of the ICC, the ICJ, Geneva Conventions, Human Rights Council, and so on.
Certainly. I'm going to speak about the South African IPSRA Citizens Bill. Just following up on my previous comment, I've managed to find, that particular finding in the fact-finding mission report when we were speaking about indiscriminate attacks and this issue, the distinction between distinction and proportionality. This is what the United Nations fact-finding mission report on task lead had to say. And this is to your audience, to your viewers who are still in two minds about whether Israel is an apartheid state or not, and whether Israel is in the right or not. Because clearly what I've mentioned so far, in terms of international law, Israel has been the violator. So in this report, it was found that Israel was duty bound under the 4th Geneva Convention to the humanitarian obligations of Gaza without qualification, because we spoke about the occupied Palestinian territories. The report condemned Israel's disproportionate use of force aimed at the supporting infrastructure, which appears to have meant the civilian population. Listen to this. This is important. The mission found blatant disregard for basic international humanitarian law and human rights norms with regard to treatment of civilians. The first Israeli attack at 11:30 a.m. on a weekday when children were returning from school and the streets of Gaza were crowded with people going about their daily businesses appears to have been calculated to create the greatest disruption and widespread panic amongst the civilian population. SADC Board and the South African Zionist Federation published an open letter in which they shamelessly expressed support for the Israeli actions, whilst they were also members of the South African Jewish community who distanced themselves from the letter of support and condemned the disproportionate use of force by the Israeli military. This is very important, Ali. This is extremely important because it says that Israel was wanting to get the maximum benefit out of its attack on the Gaza Strip. To talk about the IPSRA bill. The IPSRA bill was conceived by my involvement in the humanitarian cause and human rights. If I may carry on, Ali.
I'm still with you, Ziyaad.
Yeah. So the IPSRA bill is an avenue where we want to speak about the conversion of political rhetoric into a legal enabling framework. In other words, we know that in South Africa, we've got the political party, predominantly the ANC, that in words supports the Palestinian cause. And the ANC has a long history with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. We've heard many ministers and our president speak in favor of the Palestinians. We know that certain steps were taken, with the initiation of the BDS campaign for, the downgrading of the Israeli embassy in South Africa. But we haven't seen, concrete steps where Israelis can be held accountable. And this is where, I was involved with partner Palestinian solidarity organizations. And I also want to acknowledge the Palestine Solidarity Committee of Cape Town, who lent their support in this IPSRA initiative. IPSRA speaks about converting this environment where there's a solidarity bill that is in alignment with the Palestinian people. So what does IPSRA speak about? Just to highlight quickly, IPSRA speaks about the implementation of boycotts and imposition of economic trade, divestment and sanctions, the cessation of diplomatic relations between South Africa and Israel, strengthening customary universal jurisdiction by means of development and enhancement of principles of complementarity. This includes the process of incorporating international criminal law and lawfare mechanisms into South Africa's jurisdictional legal framework, monitoring, surveillance, and screening of South African nationals and citizens and Israeli nationals and citizens via immigration authorities who serve in the IDF. It talks about holding perpetrators accountable, including Israel state leaders accountable in the Knesset in terms of South Africa's implementation of the International Criminal Court Act, expansion on boycotts, disengagement, and non-collaboration of cultural, religious, educational, scientific, academic, institutional, environmental, water, and sanitation management, penalties and enforcement proceedings. The principal objective is the conversion of political rhetoric into a legal enabling framework, adhering to the constitutionality of IPSRA, the creation of an enforceable, accountable, and responsible human rights-based Palestinian solidarity bill for enactment with due reflection of our own colonial history and apartheid legacy, while South Africa taking the lead in solidarity legislation. The realization of all Palestinians for a free, democratic, and constitutional society entrenched with the justiciable Bill of Rights. So I know that's a lot, Ali, please forgive me, but when you draft a bill, it needs to be of that quality and caliber that, parliamentarians will want to pass, at its appointed time. But in a nutshell, what is IPSRA? IPSRA is a bill in solidarity with the Palestinian people. What's nice about IPSRA is that it can be duplicated across other jurisdictions that are also in support of the Palestinian cause. So, we have this intractable situation in the international framework, like for instance, at the United Nations, even though we've had, for instance, United Nations Resolution 2334, which condemns the expansion of settlements. In that instance, the US abstained in that vote. But anything that would hold Israel accountable, or the establishment of any special tribunal to hold Israeli commanders accountable, we know would be vetoed by the United States. So we have this intractable environment. We've got this question of jurisdictional complementarity being determined and being challenged by political states with influence, which we spoke about earlier at the ICC. So we can't say that, look, you know what, we can't advocate for Palestinians and for accountability. We can do this, by virtue of strengthening our own country's legal systems. And this is what maybe viewers that are listening can take back to their home countries, activists can take back and say, how do we duplicate the IPSRA bill or the IPSRA conception and have these kinds of solidarity bills and legislation passed in different jurisdictions. And what eventually happens is you've got countries that have now laws in place that will be screening and having surveillance of any Jews that from their countries or states that want to go and serve in the IDF and commit war crimes. They will be held accountable. There'll be a legal system within the countries that will deal with its economic relations. So whereas, you know, we always talk about boycotts, divestment, and sanctions at a level, at civic organization, IPSRA speaks about the institutionalization of boycotts, divestments, and sanctions by having it as an implemented tool of government and enforced by ministries of government to ensure that countries, you know, restrict the amount of trade that it does with the state of Israel. So the IPSRA bill is quite detailed. Ali, your viewers are able to access the IPSRA bill on my firm's website. There is details maybe that you could pass on for, you know, human rights activists that want to have a further reading of what the IPSRA bill is about. It also has an executive summary which speaks to, you know, the objectives of IPSRA in championing the Palestinian cause for justice.
Thank you for that, Ziyaad. I think this was a very informative session for me, and I think for the audience as well. And for those who are doing case studies in law, they can use these videos for academic purposes as well. Lastly, Ziyaad, for many of our audience, and then we like to think that we appeal to young people. Of course, everyone else, but specifically to young people. So for those activists who want to get into human rights defending and international human rights law, we seldom other people see as boring. The work that we do also, they think it's boring. It's not vitally. What advice would you give to young activists and to young law students who want to adventure into human rights defending, particularly international human rights law?
That's a good question, Ali. I can advise the viewers that, you know, whatever trade that you may be in, utilize those skills in advancing human rights. Find a avenue or a purpose that you can, you know, not only just benefit your own family, for instance, your community, but you can also benefit the world. And certainly standing with Palestine is a step in the right direction in creating a better world for the 21st century. So when it comes to, you know, young law students, know that international human rights is a passion. You know, the quest for justice is not something that, you know, you're born with it. It's something that you hold to your heart. You know that when there's an injustice or an oppression being perpetrated or committed against another human being, and that person cannot stand up for themselves, then it becomes your onus and your responsibility to stand up on that person that is, you know, on whom that injustice is being committed. We must also take our own example. We've got a huge history in our own country, Ali. We know what it means living in Africa, living with settler colonialism, being under the brute of apartheid. We must learn from our own leaders. You know, it was Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela. You know, it was their diligence. It was the diligence of the mass movements at the time that struggled for our freedom so that we could live in a free and more peaceful environment. And if it was not for their struggles, we would not be able to have the kind of you know, benefits of society that we have today. So we've got to always continue that struggle. And in whatever kind of vocation you may be involved, there is an avenue of benefiting mankind. Strive and look for that, and you will find great reward and satisfaction in that kind of involvement and in your own life as well. You'll find that kind of reward and satisfaction.
Once again, Comrade Ziyaad, thank you very much. You will find Ziyaad on Twitter. We have shared his handle when we were advertising this. The video is going to remain in the video tab of our Facebook. You can go there to rewind, review, but also to put up questions. There's a website, Ziyaad Patel. You can search that on Google. The website will come about. There's email and contacts for you to get in touch with Ziyaad on many issues we've raised today and many issues that you want to raise. We don't know if for private matters he charges, but he will tell you that. Once again, thank you for being with us. We appreciate the support and we look forward to working together more in Palestine.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you for the invitation. I was very honored. Thank you.
Goodbye.